A Jewish man. Yeah, I'm trying to think of his name. Yeah, I can see what he looks like. He's a big, big fellow. He was great.
So we're here this evening to listen to a presentation about Professor Lloyd Geering and the Presbyterian Church and the heresy trial, which has been given by our very own Allan Davidson. So we're very, very fortunate to have him here this evening to give us his take on the trial. I can tell you that I can remember in 1969, just after my family moved to Dunedin, that there was a lot of debate around our kitchen table about the trial. So in our household, it was very much a living thing, which means that I now discover that I was living through a very important part of Presbyterian history. So on that note, I'll hand the floor over to Allan. Just to remind you, as a matter of housekeeping, we won't be breaking for tea and coffee during the presentation. But there will, if you want to stay, you can have a tea or coffee afterwards. So thank you very much, Allan.
Thank you very much. In 2007, when they marked the 40th anniversary of the so-called heresy trial, I'll explain that why it was so called later, I was invited to take part in a symposium that was held at St Andrews on the Terrace and give two keynote addresses on the heresy trial and its context. Professor Geering was present at that, and it was a really significant day. And some of the material that I'm going to be sharing tonight is material that I prepared back then, which I've revised. Some of you might have heard a version of the Sea of Faith, which I presented some years ago, but I hope it will be a refresher course for you. Sidney Alstrom, an American church historian, refers to the 1960s and 1970s as the traumatic years for American religion and culture. He points to a disjunction between received tradition and present belief, criticisms levelled at the biblical tradition as a whole, radical criticism of both the churches and their traditional doctrines, and an increased polarisation of conservatives and liberals, which considerably augmented the country's evangelical constituency. Within the 2 decades of the 1960s and the 1970s, 1967 can be identified as something of a hinge year, both locally in New Zealand and globally. The momentous changes Alstrom refers to were beginning to open the door of gales that were to profoundly affect New Zealand culture and religion. To understand what influenced Professor Geering's trial for doctrinal error, it was a trial for doctrinal error, not a trial for heresy, in 1967, popularly known as the heresy trial, it's important to situate it within both the particular and general historical contexts of the time. James Belich, the noted New Zealand historian, in Paradise Reforged, A History of the New Zealanders, colourfully refers to the political, economic and ideological great tightening process that took place from the 1880s to the 1920s. They tried, he writes, to harmonise, homogenise and even pasteurize New Zealand society. They harmonised acknowledged differences, suppressed and camouflaged others, and purified and laundered both form and content. While some tried to challenge, resist, subvert and sidetrack this great tightening, Belich argues that socially through populism, morally through sexual puritanism and prohibition, and racially through a better British ideology, New Zealand sought to be and thought of itself as an exemplary paradise, God's own country. The churches were part of the social fabric that contributed to this great tightening, while, as Belich admits, the tight society had never been uncontested, the gradual loosening, socially, morally, and racially, began to gain momentum in the 1960s, as both external and local forces began to be felt. Something of the tight society and its loosening can be seen in the overlap of social, moral, and religious influences. Examples of that can be seen in such things as New Zealand's rigid attitude towards Sunday observance and alcohol, something many of you will remember, with strict controls on commercial and sporting activities on Sunday, tight legislation around the sale of liquor, with 6 o'clock closing persisting until October 1967, my hinge year. There was a prescriptive ideology around motherhood and the role of women, idealising the values of domesticity and the sanctity of marriage, with hostility towards divorce. The growth of the number of women in the workforce and the campaign for equal pay in the 1960s were pushing social and gender boundaries. How many of you can remember Ulysses, the film, being shown in 1967, when we had to go to separate showings for male and female? There was a strict attitude towards censorship, symbolised in 1967 by the screening of the film Ulysses to separate male and female audiences. A prudery around sexuality. An example of that was seen in the overreaction by authorities of the University of Otago to mixed flatting. This led to the suspension of a male student, and James Baxter's ribald response in his A Small Ode on Mixed Flatting. King Calvin in his grave will smile, to know, we know, that man is vile. The sit-in at Otago University in 1967 over mixed flatting led to a quick back down. And that was an indication that the baby boomers, children born after the Second World War, were beginning to exercise their opposition to authority. The protest generation in 1967, which forced a somewhat reluctant society to loosen its social, moral, sexual and racial attitudes, was coming of age and beginning to have an impact. We see that in the anti-Vietnam protest, which became a rallying cause for the anti-war movement, and its reverberations were felt in New Zealand over the next few years, leading into the anti-nuclear movement. The civil rights movement and the leadership of Martin Luther King began to sow seeds of discomfort in New Zealand as the century-long assimilationist attitudes and the integrationist ideology of the 1961 Hun report came under attack. At the Uppsala Assembly of the World Council of Churches in 1968, the programme to combat racism was born. Decolonisation in Africa, Asia and the Pacific was reshaping the world map. Second wave feminism had its roots in the 1960s and is often identified as beginning in 1963 with Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. In New Zealand, the formation in 1967 of the Society for Research on Women, and in the same year, the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women gave momentum to feminist causes. These developments in the 1960s are just pointers to the huge social, cultural and ideological shifts that were taking place in that decade, that were beginning to undermine that tight society. This was the age of hippies, flower power and slogans like "Make peace, not war." The social revolution was encapsulated in July 1967 when the Beatles issued their 8th album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band. This is often cited as one of the most influential albums of all time. The counterculture had arrived in all its psychedelic glory. The previous year, in 1966, Timothy Leary said that, like every great religion of the past, we seek to find the divinity within and to express this revelation in a life of glorification and the worship of God. These ancient goals we define in the metaphor of the present. Turn on, tune in, drop out. The hippie, radical edge of the baby boomers, was caught up with communes and LSD, flower power and sexual freedom, transcendental meditation and Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. John Lennon in 1966, in an off-the-cuff remark, said, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I don't know what will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. We're more popular than Jesus now. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me," he said. The great loosening was taking place in all sorts of strange ways. Young people were turning on to whatever gave them gratification, tuning in to an eclectic religious mix, and dropping out of the church and institutional Christianity. What about the churches and their beliefs within the rapidly evolving revolutionary social milieu of the 1960s? There was some spectacular loosening, seen, for example, in the breaking down of Catholic and Protestant hostility and the rapid development in ecumenical relationships through the impact of the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965. Fresh winds were blowing through the Catholic Church as it undid the Tridentine Reformation of the 16th century and opened itself to new relationships with Protestants, somewhat euphemistically called separated brethren. Catholics reformed their liturgy using vernacular languages. Religious orders literally lost their old habits and recovered the charism, the spiritual origins which had given them birth. But the loosening processes were also constrained by the reassertion of tradition. Pope Paul's encyclical Humanae Vitae in July 1968, which represented a restatement of a traditionalist approach, is an example of that. The encyclical rejected artificial birth control and put Catholics in a position of either thumbing their noses in the privacy of their own bedrooms at the magisterium or accepting the tight church approach to Catholic family planning. Humanae Vitae symbolised the crisis of authority that the Catholic Church faced as baby boomers increasingly rejected institutional authority. The decline in the Catholic birth rate was evidence the laity were making up their own minds on birth control. In New Zealand in 1964, ecumenical optimism was in the air, with 5 churches, Anglican, Associated Churches of Christ, Congregationalist, Methodist and Presbyterian, commencing negotiations for organic church union. The churches entered into these negotiations largely out of strength. Church statistics for membership peaked for Presbyterians in 1966. The baby boomers, as statistics from the late 1950s indicate, however, were not coming through into church membership. For Presbyterians, the Sunday school peaked in 1959 and the Bible class in 1962. Those who dreamt of one church uniting the largest Protestant and Anglican denominations could not have anticipated the relentless yearly decline in their membership that was already underway from 1967. How far the doctrinal disputes from 1966 to 1970 contributed to statistical decline of the Presbyterian Church, if at all, is very difficult to measure. The decline had set in before 1967. What Presbyterians experienced was something shared by Methodists and Anglicans in New Zealand and churches elsewhere around the globe. Doctrinal controversy was at best, or should it be at worst, only a small contributory cause in the denominational decline, rather than a major factor. The challenges to traditional theological beliefs raised in the 1960s were deeply grounded in the impact of the Enlightenment and biblical scholarship of the last 200 years. In the 1960s, these took on a new dynamic as the forces of traditional orthodoxy and the tight society clashed with those who wanted a more liberal and radical restatement of what it meant to be a Christian. While the church experienced considerable growth after the Second World War, it was not keeping up with the population increases in society. People were becoming aware of the effects of the long-standing process of secularization, that is, the freedom of society from all constraining religious influences. The loosening of laws around alcohol and Sunday observance were indicative of that secularization. The church was increasingly marginalised from the role which it believed it had to act as the guardian and arbiter of the oversight of morality in society. The restatement of Christian beliefs in innovative ways meant that old wineskins were no longer any use in containing the new wine. Theology was concerned not only about the content of religious beliefs, but also the containers in which they were expressed. Two examples of that were seen in the appropriation of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's ideas around religionless Christianity, which stood without the need of an institution. Harvey Cox picked this up in 1965 in the celebration of the secular city. John Robinson expressed Bonhoeffer's sentiments in 1963 in his populist Honest to God, in which he succinctly challenged the three-decker universe of heaven, earth and hell, and gave public recognition to Tillich's God, who was to be understood as the ground of all being. The omnipotent, omniscient, supernatural, ineffable, transcendent God was being brought down to earth. Some went further and took up Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead. Gabriel Bahanian, in The Death of God, the culture of our post-Christian era in 1961, argued that Western culture is no longer responsive to traditional conceptualizations about the divine, and Christianity itself has been mainly responsible for this kind of death because it has contributed to the domestication of God. Others, such as Thomas Altizer and William Hamilton, rejected transcendence and theistic language. In the face of secularization, there was a call for the church to reconceive God. This climaxed in 1966 with Time's cover, Is God Dead? The tight theological world of neo-Orthodox systematic theologians like Karl Barth was being challenged. According to Time, the existence of a personal God who created the world and sustains it with his love is now subject to profound attack. Time recognised, however, that a majority of Christians would presumably prefer to stay with the traditional language of revelation at any cost. It was within the rapidly changing social, cultural, ecclesiastical, theological, moral and political context of the 1960s that Lloyd Geering rose to prominence. It's interesting to note that his route into the Presbyterian ministry was not a conventional one. He had not been enculturated into the Presbyterian church through Sunday school or Bible class. His was an intellectual conversion as a university student from atheism to Christianity. Geering had studied mathematics to honours level, and he revealed a sharp and penetrating intellect that cut through obfuscation and traditional dogma. His parish ministry, however, was quite conventional, at Coorau, Opaho in Dunedin, and Newton in Wellington. He was very involved in the 1950s in national church affairs. He was the convener of the Statistics Committee, bringing sharp analysis to the state of the church. He was convener of the Church Union Committee in the 1950s, which worked to bring Presbyterians, Methodists, and Congregationalists together. The stillbirth of his first child and the death of his first wife were personal aspects of his life, which had a profound impact on his understanding of death and the afterlife. Lloyd Geering's commitment to study was seen in his completion of a Bachelor of Divinity degree through the Melbourne College of Divinity, while he was fully engaged in parish ministry. and also undertaking those responsibilities in the wider church. He taught Old Testament in Brisbane before returning to Dunedin in 1960 as Professor of Old Testament Studies at the Presbyterian Theological Hall, Knox College, and he became principal of that institution in 1963. Indications of his concern about the need for theology to engage with the world were seen in What is Our Gospel?, a study booklet he edited for a National Council of Churches Faith and Order Conference in 1964. In his autobiography, he notes, "Already I was beginning to feel that the churches were shutting their eyes to the many intellectual challenges that the modern world, global and scientific in its outlook, was presenting to the traditional expression of the Christian faith." These views were presented to Presbyterians in 1965, when he wrote an article in the Presbyterian magazine, The Outlook, for Reformation Sunday. In drawing attention to John Robinson's latest book, The New Reformation, he wrote, "Either we must shut our eyes to the worldview of our day and cling tenaciously to one of the earliest expressions of the Christian faith, or we must abandon the Christian faith as now outmoded. But the worldview of our day is too compelling to be ignored. While it continues to be ignored, the Christian faith will continue to diminish in its influence in the world at the present alarming rate." Unexpectedly, Professor Geering found himself at the centre of a bitter theological debate. The doctrinal disputes that raged in the Presbyterian Church between 1966 and 1970 were a replay in a small denominational Southern Hemisphere outpost of the debates which were bubbling away in the Northern Hemisphere, in English-speaking Protestant circles. What gave particular focus and significance to these debates in New Zealand were the smallness of the Presbyterian Church and the tight nature of society, the monopoly of the Press Association on news and the pervasiveness of one television channel, and the status and position of the leading proponent of the new theological ideas. It was almost too difficult for the tightly organised Presbyterian Church to contain the breadth of theological diversity which the debate expressed. It's been said that one person's heresy is another person's orthodoxy. That became very apparent in the trial in 1967, when R.J. Robert or Bob Wardlaw produced an evidence of Professor Geering's theological error, an address that Professor Geering had given to Canterbury University students. As Professor Geering noted, this illustrates the curious fact that what I regard as explanation of my faith, Mr. Wardlaw regards as evidence of my guilt. Newspapers, radio and television gave prominent coverage to the issues. They not only reported on the debate, but they helped create it. Doctrinal dispute was headline news in 1966 and 1967. Professor Geering's status as principal in the Theological Hall was viewed by some alarmists as potentially corrupting the Church's future ministers. For decades, there had been suspicion among more conservative Presbyterian ministers and people in the Church about the influence liberal theological teachers had on their students. The possibility of setting up an alternative theological college was seriously canvassed by some conservative Presbyterians during the controversy in the 1960s, and some students chose to go offshore in order to get their theological education. There were two key factors or events that were the catalyst for the trial in 1967. The first was the publication of Professor Geering's article on the resurrection in the 1966 Easter edition of the church paper, The Outlook. This included a quotation from Ronald Gregor Smith, a Scottish theologian, that we may freely say that the bones of Jesus lie somewhere in Palestine. This was seen as a denial of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. it led to an outcry, culminating in a public meeting of Presbyterian laymen in the Auckland Town Hall, sponsored by Sir James Fletcher, a one-time member of this church, and Sir William Goodfellow, who I think was a member of Somerville. A New Zealand Association of Presbyterian Laymen was established, and R.J. Wardlaw, an advertising executive, was elected as national chairman. The association aimed to, quote, defend the historic faith of Presbyterians. Theological debate raged throughout the country, as I said, in newspapers, in churches, and on television. Professor Geering recalls in his autobiography how Robert Wardlaw and himself were interviewed by Austin Mitchell and Graham Billing on a gallery TV program, which was recorded a second time because the interviewers thought that the two combatants had been too nice to each other. The second event was Professor Geering's sermon in March 1967 at the opening service for Victoria University. His words, that man has no immortal soul, were taken out of context by a reporter who rang up church leaders in Wellington without giving them any context and asked them their opinion. The media then fanned these words into a full-blown controversy, failing to recognise that Professor Geering dismissing the immortality of the soul was in fact quite orthodox, because it is not a Christian orthodox doctrine. The wider context in which he said this, where he expressed, quote, the eternal hope in terms of eternal life, was largely overlooked by his opponents. People were willing to hear what they wanted to hear. I'm not going to analyse the intricate unravelling of events from 1966 to 1970 in any great detail. I have prepared another handout, which those of you who want to see those step-by-step stages that the Presbyterians went through, it's a 4-page, very closely detailed account of what happened, particularly through the General Assembly. You're welcome to take a copy of that at the end of the lecture. What I would like to try to do is draw out some of the reflections on what took place in a way which I hope will help us understand the implications of the doctrinal dispute. First, the leadership by laymen in response to the theological challenges raised by Professor Geering was unparalleled in New Zealand. The outrage expressed by laymen such as R.J. Wardlaw struck a chord with others. Rollo Arnold, senior lecturer in education at Victoria University, later professor, who headed up the Presbyterian Laymen's Association in Wellington and took over the leadership of the movement after Wardlaw left the Presbyterian Church, wrote that, like many others, I felt my personal integrity flouted and called in question. Here was the Church's most prominently placed teacher, relishing what I have taught to hundreds of Presbyterians in sermons and classes. During the 1950s, the New Life movement in the Presbyterian Church, which was concerned about the renewal and growth of Presbyterianism throughout New Zealand, drew heavily on lay leadership. Many of these leaders were returned servicemen, and many laymen became elders in the church in the 1950s. The New Life movement focused on evangelism and church extension, with a great emphasis on stewardship. The broadening and deepening of theological understanding was not a priority. Many lay people were therefore taken by surprise by the so-called new theology that Professor Geering was beginning to articulate. As Geering later noted in response to his 1964 Faith and Order study booklet, What is Our Gospel?, the churches were in no mood to be challenged or even questioned. In the light of subsequent events, it can be seen as a lost opportunity. One of the first steps that eventually led to the 1967 trial was taken in the session at Somerville Presbyterian Church in Remuera. Brian Harris, who taught classics at the University of Auckland, and R.J. Wardlaw were both elders on the Somerville session. 4 days after the publication of the Easter Outlook in April 1966, in which Geering had quoted from Ronald Gregor Smith, Brian Harris raised concerns about Professor Geering's article on the resurrection. The session agreed to take this up through the presbytery. The minister at Somerville at the time was the Reverend Ed Farr. He was not a conservative minister by any means. There is a question, however, as to how far the gap between the pulpit and the pew, or perhaps the minister's study and the congregation, had not been bridged by preaching that kept people up to date with the changes which had taken place in attitudes to the Bible and theological scholarship over the last 50 years or more. Many older ministers were out of touch with the latest learning. My second point is around parish sociology and the way in which this contributes to the tight attitudes towards traditional teaching. A minister depended on his, and it was mainly men then, a minister depended on his congregation for his livelihood. Many people included people who ranged along a theological spectrum from conservative to liberal. Sermons often used language that could be heard in different ways. The clarity of Professor Geering's articles, addresses, sermons and media interviews cut through the ambiguity of traditional hymns and pulpit rhetoric. Lay conservatives and some clergy reacted in protection mode, mounting the ramparts in defence of what they conceived as biblical authority and theological orthodoxy. Some vigorous theological debate took place, but pastoral sensitivity on the part of some ministers to the distress and upset that people felt in response to the new challenging theology resulted in an attempt to smooth over the issues being raised by the debate. There is also a question as to how far during the doctrinal disputes 1966 to 1970 there was a loss of theological nerve among liberals in the Presbyterian Church. Neil Wright, a member of this church, examined the impact of the Geering controversy on St Luke's in the 1960s. Despite having a liberal-minded minister, Norman Gilkison, Neil concluded from looking at previous sermons and the church newsletter that, quote, like much of the Presbyterian Church, theological inquiry at St Luke's seems to have been stifled, at least in public. Third, following on from this, and here my approach coincides in part with what Jim Veitch argued in 1997, the attempt by liberals and broad church leaders to manage the theological controversy. What they saw as a crisis in the years 1966, 70 backfired and played into the hands of the conservatives. There was an attempt to control or even to close the debate down. That was seen, for example, when the Doctrine Committee in 1966 came to the 1966 Assembly with a prepared preliminary statement on the resurrection. They wanted to take the heat out of the debate, but they were trying to pour water on flames that could not be extinguished. They fell back on traditional language, seen, for example, in the following statement about the resurrection of Jesus. God raised him from the dead and triumphed over sin and death to reign with the Father as sovereign over all. A very traditional statement. The committee failed to take seriously the issues Professor Geering had raised in his articles. They took the safe option and kicked for theological touch. But to carry on the analogy, the game was not over, and the theological football was soon very much in play. The attempt to manage the controversy was seen also in 1967 after the Man Has No Immortal Soul headline in the Dominion. On the one hand, Stan Reed, the moderator, declined to hold a special General Assembly as R.J. Wardlaw and the Layman's Association requested. On the other hand, Reed led a delegation to Professor Geering in Holy Week, with the unfortunate symbolism that implied, asking, as Geering recalled, to do all in my power to prevent the controversy hurting the Church. In May, with doctrinal charges in the wind, Reed declared that until the General Assembly met in November, further discussion on the case within the Church was sub judice. Liberals tended to sit back and let things happen. The preservation of peace and unity. became the primary goal for church leaders. The opportunity for debate, education and discussion was largely lost. In 1967, I was in my first year as a student in the Theological Hall, with Lloyd Geering as my Professor of Old Testament and Principal of the Presbyterian Ministry Training Institution. This photo, and you can look for me there, and some of you might see me, it was actually taken in 1969 in our exit year. We are a very conformist, male-suited and respectably tied, and with one exception, a Pākehā group. The photo of all the staff and students in 1969 shows only 5 women students, among 59 men. We fitted Bellich's description of the 1960s New Zealand society as homogenous, conformist, masculist, egalitarian and monocultural, subject to heavy formal and informal regulation. That's reflected in this photo. Principal Geering presides somewhat benignly over this largely homogenous, male-dominated group of future church leaders. And yet, the atmosphere in the church was anything but benign towards its principal. My recollection of the Theological Hall in 1967 is not of lively debate on the issues that Professor Geering was raising, but of living within the eye of a cyclone that was enveloping the church and wider society. I think as students we were too frightened to address the issues because of the division that would come amongst us. Ian Brewer, Professor of Church History, who represented the most conservative voice on the Theological Hall staff, later wrote that while the staff didn't necessarily agree with Professor Geering, they were deeply appreciative of his personal integrity and his work as a colleague. Perhaps they failed, he writes, to show the church how to engage in controversy that was hard-hitting but fair. It was sobering to note the way in which people were unable to see or hear aspects of Geering's arguments, and how even ministers criticised him for making statements that were paraphrases of biblical texts. Yet, if these issues could not be clarified in the hall as part of the course, how could ministers and congregations be blamed for their failures? The preservation of peace and unity became something of an Achilles heel for both parishes, the Theological Hall and the church. As Brewer noted, the model of unity was too limited to cope with working through differences. In answer to the charge that he had disturbed the peace and unity of the church, Professor Geering responded during the heresy trial in 1967 that at the very point where there are more people talking about theological issues in New Zealand than ever before, we want to hush it all up and return to our peaceful congregation cocoons. I would suggest that what my accusers have been pleased to call the peace of the church is more properly called the sleepiness of the church, and we should be thankful to God that it has been disturbed. My fifth point is that the trial represented a clash of irreconcilable worldviews. This was seen in the use of traditional teachings of the church, particularly the Westminster Confession of Faith, and the appeal to the authority of Scripture. The General Assembly in November 1967 heard the charges of doctrinal error against Professor Geering, presented by R.J. Wardlaw and the Reverend R.J. Blakey, minister at St Heliers, who independently brought his own charges. Robert Wardlaw was not theologically trained. It's somewhat surprising that the conservative ministers who belonged to the Westminster Fellowship didn't take a lead in pressing heresy charges, but left them over to a layman. Robert Blakey, in contrast to Wardlaw, was theologically trained. He had an honours degree in philosophy from the University of Edinburgh and a Bachelor of Divinity degree from St Andrews University. In his book, Secular Christianity and God Who Acts, published in 1970, Blakey said in the preface that to ask the right questions, students are told, is more important than to know the right answers, for the answers depend on the questions. As far as he was concerned, Professor Geering was not asking the right questions, and he was getting the wrong answers. After the charges of doctrinal error were presented to the Assembly, there was a few days gap, and then Professor Geering was given time to prepare and give his response. Following his address, the three then had a further right of reply to each other. Using scriptural proof texts and appealing to the Westminster Confession of Faith, the subordinate standard of the Church, R.J. Wardlaw charged Professor Geering with denying the supernatural, denying Scripture as God's revelation, denying the deity of Christ, denying the resurrection, and denying the life to come. Robert Blakey, in contrast, set out some of Professor Geering's statements alongside biblical texts and included sections from the Westminster Confession in an appendix. In the light of these, he asked the Church to clarify its teaching about eternal life, the resurrection, miracles, and the supernatural power of God, the doctrine of God, the Bible as God's revelation, God, and prayer. At the heart of Wardlaw's charges was confidence in the traditional doctrines of the Church, as expressed in the Westminster Confession, and the belief that the Bible could be used literally and uncritically to uphold these doctrines. For Blakey, there was a simple trust in the use of words to express clearly and unambiguously what the Church believed. In response, Professor Geering answered, quote, that the kind of appeal Mr. Wardlaw quite understandably wants to make both to past confessions and to the Bible has been completely superseded. While the clarification Mr. Blakey has called upon the Assembly to offer them is something which is beyond the power of any church to provide. Arguing that beliefs are secondary to faith itself, Professor Geering concluded, there is much of the forms and doctrines of the Church that the Church must be prepared to lose in order that faith may burst forth again in new life in this new world we have entered. Old Orthodoxy was confronting new theology. As the cartoon shows to us, there is a question as to who owns the Church, conservatives or liberal, and in 1967 the Church was being pulled apart. Sixth, the pastoral approach taken by the Assembly failed to deal with the issues raised in the debate. The Reverend J.M. Bates, one of the Church's leading theologians, and the Reverend Ron Hay, minister at St Paul's Napier, after the speeches by the accusers and the defendant and their replies, just proposed a simple motion that the charges be dismissed. The Reverend J.S. Murray, Secretary of the Church's Overseas Missions Committee, and the Reverend Owen Baragwanath, Minister of St David's Khyber Pass, Auckland, two senior ministers, moved an amendment. It was a long motion, which tried to balance respect for Professor Geering with recognition of the way his opponents had been deeply disturbed by his teaching. The motion counselled Professor Geering and others to balance critical comments with positive affirmations. It recognised the sincerity and earnestness of those who had laid charges, and it declared that no doctrinal error has been established, and that the case was closed. A further simple amendment was moved by the Reverend W.C. Downward of Huntley and the Reverend Ian Purdy of St Andrews Hamilton. This was adopted as the substantive motion and carried without dissentience. Quote, that the Assembly judges that no doctrinal error has been established, dismisses the charges, and declares the case closed. A pastoral letter was drafted under the convenership of J.S. Murray. The substance of the defeated Murray-Baragwanath amendment was included. The letter recognised the need of the Church to rethink its message to the world so that it can be expressed in form and words that are intelligible to the changing generations. This required, the letter noted, a large degree of freedom to think, write and speak in ways that may seem inconsistent with traditional patterns of thought. But this freedom also needed to take account of the doctrinal standards of the Church. The letter declared the General Assembly's confidence in Professor Geering as minister, theological teacher and its principal, but the letter also declared its appreciation of the faith, devotion and concern for the gospel which led Mr. Wardlaw and Mr. Blakey to act as they did. The church was trying to pacify all factions, attempting to pour oil on troubled waters. The attempt to try and resolve doctrinal difference by trial and debate failed. The pursuit of peace and unity and a pastoral approach smoothed over the cracks in the theological differences in the church. These, however, didn't allow for open recognition of diversity of opinion. My seventh point, the tightening of the church. The attempts to paper over the theological cracks in 1967 continued in the next three General Assemblies in 68, 69 and 70. In 1968, the Doctrine Committee, in which Professor Geering was an ex officio member, included in its membership Robert Blakey and one of Geering's adversaries, and Rollo Arnold, who had taken a lead in the layman's opposition to Professor Geering. The committee concerned itself with the nature of confessional authority, a statement on fundamental doctrines, and a simple contemporary statement of faith. In 1969, the Assembly accepted what it means to subscribe to a statement of faith and accepted a statement on the fundamental doctrines of the Christian faith. Professor Ian Gruard in the 1969 Assembly proposed a motion which was passed, which drew on the wording originally proposed by Brian Harris, but which had been rejected at the 1968 Assembly. This stated that the resurrection is, quote, a saving act of God in history, and is therefore more than a continuation of the memory and example of Jesus Christ and the awakening of faith in the disciples. This represented, I suggest, a process of theological tightening, as the church defined what it believed over against what Professor Geering had written. It circumscribed liberty of opinion with clearer statements of what the church beliefs were and what it meant to take office in the church through subscribing to the church's standards. Professor Geering's book, God in the New World, which he had forewarned the church of his trial was about to be published, appeared in 1968. It drew both positive and negative reaction according to the theological stance of the reader. Geering identified his audience as, quote, those who are genuinely wanting to know what to make of Christianity in this new and fast-changing world. The General Assembly, however, was not open to promoting debate around what Professor Geering was saying. Instead, they wanted to try and close it down. Robert Blakey, who in his charges against Professor Geering in 1967 had asked him for clear affirmations in 7 areas, including his beliefs on life beyond death, the historicity of the resurrection, and the bodily nature of the resurrection attested by the empty tomb, in no small measure achieved for the church by 1969 what he had been unable to achieve with respect to Professor Geering in 1967. While Blakey had lost the battle in 1967, he had achieved victory on a broader front. Jim Veitch concluded that the conservative evangelical received what they wanted, a tight definition of doctrine to stem the impact of secularization on the thinking of the Presbyterians. My 8th area is the impact on church union. The theological tightening in the Presbyterian Church in the years 1968 to 70 represented what Jim Veitch has referred to as a loss of theological nerve in the church. Professor Geering was pushing out boundaries further than even some liberals were willing to accept. While some lay people rejoiced, in fact many lay people rejoiced in the broader theological freedom found in his ideas, many moderate and liberal ministers, in the face of hostility and the potential loss of members, adopted the pastoral approach I mentioned earlier. For some liberals, the heresy trial and doctrinal disputes were a distraction from the ecumenical cause, which was the main focus of their energies. The Act of Commitment in May 1967, the same year as the heresy trial, saw the 5 negotiating churches, Anglican, Associated Churches of Christ, Congregational, Methodist and Presbyterians, declaring in St. Paul's Cathedral in Wellington that they had been led to the conviction that God's will for them is that they should seek union. What was not apparent to them at the time was that the organic union of churches embraced a comprehensive view of church and society, which belonged to the bygone Christendom era, which was quickly passing away. The cracks were already beginning to appear as Pentecostal churches from the 1960s and the charismatic movement began their surge in church membership, which drew some people away from the ecumenical churches or redirected their energies towards a spiritualized Christianity. This new spiritual sectarianism was a sign of the growing pluralistic world and a challenge to traditional cradle-to-the-grave denominational loyalty, which in part contributed to the end of Christendom. The Presbyterian doctrinal dispute became a reason for some to retreat into an experientially based form of church, where the kinds of intellectual and theological questions Professor Geering was asking were a non-issue. In this context, belief was shaped by feeling and experience, rather than rigorous thinking. Challenges were also coming from within the ecumenical churches that were unsettled by the whole debate. While individual Anglicans spoke out in support of Professor Geering and his ideas, a special synod was held in the Nelson diocese, a diocese noted for its evangelical tone, and this met in 1968. The synod, in its resolution, affirmed, quote, belief in miracles, bodily resurrection of Jesus, and personal life after death. This was taken up in the General Synod in May 1968. It referred to meeting in these days of theological uncertainty and stated its belief that God has acted and acts in history, and especially affirmed the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead as such an event, and not simply as an apprehension of faith by man. While these resolutions didn't include the Nelson emphasis on bodily resurrection, the resolution represented the conjunction of anti-church union sentiments with anti-Geering and pro-conservative theological approaches. The rejection of the plan for union by Anglicans in 1974 by a very narrow vote should not be attributed solely to the impact of the doctrinal dispute. This dispute was just one and probably a minor factor in the 1974 decision, but it was a factor. In the late 1960s, this anti-Geering sentiment alarmed some ecumenists who gave less attention to the restatement of theological orthodoxy in the Presbyterian Church than they did to the attempt to shape the theology of what they hoped would be a new ecumenical inclusive church. And we'll take a sigh, this is my final point. Closing down the debate. The result of the doctrinal definitions in the General Assembly in 1968 and 69 was a tightening of theological boundaries. An immediate impact of this tightening on the liberal voice was seen in the decision of the 1970 General Assembly. A newspaper report from Brisbane earlier in 1970 reported that Professor Geering had said that there is no afterlife, neither heaven nor hell, that the Holy Mother was not a virgin, that Christ did not literally rise from the dead, Christians could speak of Jesus as the Son of God, but not in a physical sense, and that the Ascension was a myth. A motion was carried by the 1970 Assembly, dissociating itself from statements made in Brisbane by Professor Geering on the resurrection and life after death. The standards by which he was judged were the Assembly resolutions on the resurrection in 1969 and life after death in 1967. There were 56 dissentients or opponents, that is, these were supporters of Professor Geering who had their names entered into the minutes of the General Assembly. 45 of them were ministers, there were 3 deaconesses and only 8 elders. Professor Geering, who was present at the Assembly, was not invited to explain his position. He reflected on this in his autobiography that, quote, one of the chief problems through the continuing theological controversy was that people were not able to distinguish between historical factual statements on the one hand and theological or metaphorical on the other. Those who attempted to manage the doctrinal disputes in the past remained largely silent. Liberals found themselves on the losing side. This was to be a position they were to experience more and more over the succeeding years. And so to my conclusion. Let me recall the words of Bellich, which I used earlier, of New Zealand from the 1880s to the 1920s. They tried, he writes, to harmonise, homogenise and even pasteurise New Zealand society. They harmonised acknowledged differences, suppressed and camouflaged others, and purified and laundered both form and content. There is a question for me as to how far the doctrinal debates between 1967 and 1970 resulted in a great tightening in the Presbyterian Church. At the time, a great loosening was going on in both New Zealand and globally. There were two worldviews that couldn't be reconciled. The Church not only ended up dissociating itself from Professor Geering's views, it closed down the possibility of open theological debate, and in Jim Veitch's words, pushed underground attempts to face secularisation and pluralism, something from which the Church has never fully recovered. Since 1970, with the exception of the work of the St Andrew's Trust, Professor Geering has found his audience outside the institutional church, in the university, continuing education classes, groups such as the Sea of Faith Network, the Jesus Seminar, conducted tours overseas, newspaper columns, radio broadcasts, books and articles, and public lectures. On one rare occasion in 1990, he was invited by the moderator of the day, John Murray, to address the Presbyterian General Assembly. Professor Geering on that occasion challenged the Church to consider whether it wanted to be a sect or a church. The sect he described as a minority group chiefly concerned with its own spiritual welfare. It ignores the society which it lives in, except to use it as a recruiting ground for occasional converts. While the Church was seen as chiefly concerned with the destiny of society in which it lives, its own destiny is quite secondary. The destiny for society in Professor Geering's thinking and writing has moved far away from Christian orthodoxy and the heresy concerns of 1967. In his millennium book, The World to Come, in response to the ecological and environmental catastrophe, he suggests that the future church is contributing to a new emerging global religion and spirituality in which God is identified with the world. The heresy trial of 1967 was an anachronism. The trial was a totally unsatisfactory way of promoting theological debate. It was more concerned with closing down debate rather than opening up the exploration of what it meant to be a Christian in the contemporary world. The trial could not deal with radically different attitudes towards biblical authority, traditional orthodoxy, understandings of faith and history. What then of heresy today? The pursuit of heresy as the narrow attempt to impose dogmatic orthodoxy is even more outmoded, I would suggest, in 2015 than in 1967. In our postmodern world, meta-narratives have collapsed and cannot restore the sacred canopy of the past. The reality, as Callum Brown indicates, is that we have to recognise the multiple overlapping narratives that contribute to the rich diversity of religious beliefs held by people in society today. Heresy, as its original Greek meaning indicates, is about choice. The invitation Professor Geering offers people today is to become heretics in the narrative choice we make to ensure that the planet which sustains us flourishes and that the life of humanity and all living things is enhanced. Paul Morris, Professor of Religious Studies at Victoria University, in celebrating Professor Geering as the prophet of modernity, concluded that he has, quote, broken down much of the traditional mistrust of the discussion of religion in the contemporary world. His success can be gauged in that very few are indifferent to what he has to say, because his concerns are indicative of a wider secular society attempting to come to terms with the legacy of the 20th century, with globalisation, with modernity itself. While the Church, or at least that part of it that has wanted to maintain traditional orthodoxy, has often had difficulty listening to and engaging with Professor Geering's evolving theology, he has become a much respected prophet in New Zealand society, as the honour of his membership of the Order of New Zealand Merit indicates. In some ways, we can ironically thank Professor Geering's opponents in 1967 and the trial for heresy for helping give him the public profile which he has used to such good effect over these last 48 years. But all honour is due to Lloyd himself for his rigorous and fearless public working out of his faith in the new and ever-changing world, and his ongoing challenge to all people to value human life and the world which sustains it. Thank you. Now, I'm willing to take questions, but you might like to just have a moment to talk to the person alongside you. So if you've got a question, you can try it out on the person next to you and sharpen up your question a little bit. So just, you might like to stand up and have a little stretch for a moment. Small reflections. Some of you were there. I know at least one person I know who was there at the trial in 1967. My father was there as an elder, the only assembly that he ever attended. I don't know if he understood the issues that were being debated. And afterwards shook Lloyd Geering by the hand and felt good in doing that. Yes, Roger.
Thank you very much, Allan, for a wonderful address. Thank you all for 1 hour. Looking back now to see the utter stupidity and the tragedy of pouring oil on troubled waters, trying to build peace between people without having the opportunity, a wonderful opportunity, to explore the issues they have been inviting. It's like the failure, because people opportunities to learn. How best might we have managed that on reflection?
I think it's a very good question. As part of the Presbyterian theological training, we had to do summer supply. We had to go 3 months in the parish as part of our training. And at the end of 1967, 68, I went to, of all places, Cobden, Ranunga on the west coast. I am from the west coast, so it was close to home. And it was so easy to talk about theology. You go knock on the door and just say that I was a Presbyterian student. Immediately, people would open up issues, and there was, I think, a readiness for debate. I think Ian Brewer gives us some clues in that quotation that I gave from him, that the leaders in the theological hall were not able to deal with these issues themselves in a way that could set a model. I think the great fear was that, on the one hand, you have a church that's has a long tradition, that it would fly apart. And so there wasn't the openness and willingness to debate the issues. And the trial process, I think, sets up adversaries and doesn't allow for the discussion. I think it needed some wise leadership of people who could say, let's take this opportunity to listen to each other. I'm interested that, in Australia, in the Uniting Church there, when they have debated the issue of homosexuality, they had what they call their year of listening. Because the debate was a very difficult one and a fierce one, they had this year of listening, and they facilitated listening, and they tried to get different groups talking with one another. Maybe, that's, one of the things is we can't change the past. We can only learn from it.
But Allan, then the inflexibility of the Book of Order, in the way in which these matters were able to be dealt with.
Yes.
Total inflexibility.
Yes, and this is where you have the institutional church representing a tradition, a way of dealing with things, and the two worldviews clashing with one another. And the Book of Order really is not able to solve those things. The heresy trial, that's the popular way we see it, was not the first one in New Zealand. Presbyterians actually had quite a long record of trials, but it was the most notable one.
Reading ourselves up.
There also had been a Bible demonstration meeting in the Auckland Town Hall with 3,000 people there in 1929 when Henry Major, an Anglican, came back. He was a modernist. He came back and They organised a Bible demonstration meeting in the Auckland Town Hall, 3,000 people. So, you know, these issues, this was the time of the great fundamentalist debates in the United States. Yes, I think the church really didn't have the mechanisms to deal with it. I think you're quite right.
It still doesn't.
No.
We've still got the Westminster debate on the homosexual thing, and
Yes, well, one of the principles of the Reformation is that we're reformed but still reforming. You know, that's a basic principle of the Reformation. But once you accept confessions as doctrinal standards, that process of reforming is frozen in a sense. You know, the Westminster Confession of Faith was actually developed to deal with the situation in England originally, at the time of the Civil War, after the bishops, the system of bishops was taken out root and branch, as they said, and they needed a new system of church government. And so the Westminster Assembly of Divines met there were Scottish representatives, and they were dealing with the issues of the church in England in the 1640s. As it happened when the Anglicans came back, they didn't want anything to do with these documents, but they were taken, they were accepted by the Church of Scotland, and so became very much part of the Presbyterian baggage that was then brought to New Zealand, Australia and elsewhere. But that confessional approach, one can understand it at the time of the Reformation, where you were protesting as Protestants over against the teaching of Rome. And so one can understand confession, but each age needs to be writing its own confession. They need to be evolving. They need to be using the language and imagery of the world in which we live. And we tended to freeze ourselves, I think, through our confessional approach.
How much was what Lloyd Geering was saying, how much was that seen as a new set of beliefs that would become an orthodoxy in their own right? And how different was that from what he was trying to do?
From his views in 1970. And then, of course, he becomes Professor of Religious Studies in 1970, and he moves outside the church, although continues to be a minister of the church and a member at St Andrews on the Terrace. Dorothy.
I'd just like to reflect really on younger women at that time, in the 1960s, and Ian and I were on the farm, and Ian was session clerk. He went to that assembly in 1967. Allan was born that year. But a lot of things were happening for women over that time as well. I was part of Stroh, but as well as that, it was birth control.
Yes.
There was a development of the play centre movement. And in rural districts, which I knew best there, the women were taking those things on, and we were becoming much more open to ideas, often more than some of the city youth, because in a way we were more isolated, but we were free. We were also influenced by what Joan Anderson was doing and what she was writing, and there were some strong Presbyterian women around who were leaders, and I suppose naively we didn't see ourselves, at least I didn't. We were just groups of people in the country. We went to church and we did things, and if we were told to discuss ideas like stewardship, liberation, all those kind of things. But I think we have to, the growth there in the 60s, what was happening to women, that she had a greater impact. I'm just realising it now listening to you.
Yes, I agree completely with you, and I think that's part of this great loosening that's happening in society. The church, though, was still largely male-led and governed in terms of its decision-making. Look at that photograph. There were no women in the photograph. There were some women at the assembly, the photographs that we had in the background. So yes, it was the whole growth of the feminist movement, and I think feminism, this second wave feminism, opened up women to new ideas, and that was reflected, I think, in the development of feminist theology in the 70s, in particular, and the challenge to the patriarchy of the church institution, the challenge to exclusive language, all those things. The 60s were a time of ferment. All these things. I've only given you some examples. in 1961, was it the pill becomes available? That has a huge impact on people's attitude towards sex. Right, yes.
Coming to the year 2015, do you think at this time what we need? Have we lost the fear we had before? Do we have to learn to live with uncertainty while we are still evolving and thinking and finding new ideas?
I'm a historian, happy dealing with the past. That's a cop-out. That's a cop-out.
Just a few tips of advice, that's all.
Well, I do think it's, I do think, the historical role that I've been doing tonight is important, and that, as I said, we can't change the past. We can only try to understand it and maybe redeem it in our own context today. What does that redemption mean? What does it mean to? You don't like redemption? Well, I think of redemption as what went on in South Africa through Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So redemption to me is a very powerful word in that kind of context. But in terms of the contemporary issues, I think we have to be facing up to some of the major questions that Professor Geering is raising about, for example, the whole question of the future of the earth and the future of humanity if we continue to spoil it and exploit it. These are ultimate questions, and these are religious questions, deeply religious, and there's a tradition that we can draw on that can help us answer those questions. So I think I'd be responding and saying we've got to identify what are the major questions that face our age and how do we deal with them. Violence, terrorism, these are some of the issues of poverty. Look at the migration going on into Europe. These are issues, and asking ourselves, well, where does, what is the, response that we want to see being made if we are Christians in the name of Christ in this, or the name of Jesus in this situation. John?
Is it generally accepted possibly that we're entering or already in another tightening period?
I think there is this loosening, tightening thing that's happening. When you look at things like the Marriage Amendment Act and the way in which New Zealand society very quickly has changed in attitudes towards inclusiveness. The churches, in some ways, the Presbyterian churches is still back, in an older era, and that's declared in itself. Whereas society is in a very different area.
The churches generally, I feel, are tightening.
Well, and that's, I think, where Geering's challenge of the 1990 Assembly about does the church want to be a sect or does it want to be a church? Is a very real one. A sect, I think, tends to be inward-looking. It's concerned about its own life rather than the life of the world.
Yeah, it's used as an instrument of political control within the church.
Yes, yes. You know quite a lot about that.
Yeah, I do.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Oh, well. What about oh, well, I'm still reading the 3G poll.
I have a question in the front here.
Well, I just want to make a statement on the fact that I think that the greatest gift that Geering has given us is to be able to question. It was like he was giving us a license to question all those years ago. I happened to be one that was at the trials. I actually worked for the Presbyterian Social Service at that time, which was across the road, and went and heard, and the tension of the atmosphere within the place is something that you vividly, I was only a young person of about 18 or 19, and a young woman of those times, and I definitely remember it on that score. But I do remember that feeling of I can question. I don't have to go along with what I'm hearing from the pulpit. I can question and I can think for myself. So I just want to make that statement of, I hope that that essence of thinking and questioning can be one of the gifts that we give to the generations to come.
That's a really helpful contribution. I was sitting exams in my first year when the whole issue was happening up in Christchurch. I was down in Dunedin. But I remember they broadcast, I think it was on, I'm not sure, the following Sunday, they broadcast Geering's response, his speech, and it was electrifying to hear that.
I went to many of his lectures when he was at Auckland University,
Yes.
and used to just love the way he would rub his head
Yes.
and think and give you an answer.
Yes,
And
yes.
he would be able to reflect on what the other person was trying to say in their voice.
Yes. Yes, I think he had it.
He had a great gift in that way,
Yes.
or he still has.
Indeed. How many people here did go to the 1967 assembly? We've got Ian, Evan, 3 of you. So we've got eyewitnesses to this very significant event. Yes, John again.
Just to say that the CFA conference is at St Cuthbert's on the 2nd to the 4th of October, and Lloyd is giving an address, I think it's the first address, on the future of religion, I think his topic is. If anybody wants to go just to that lecture, it's possible. You can pay to go, but it's...
Won't be much.
Can you give the time, the date again?
I should have it at my fingertips. It's the conference is Friday the 2nd, beginning at about 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
And I think Lloyd's talking that afternoon. We'd have to check that. And the conference finishes on... Sorry?
The CFA has a website, don't they?
Yes.
Yes.
So if you go to the CFA website, you'll get the details there.
I think it's .org.
Yeah. That's it.
Yes, it's all there on the website.
Any other questions, issues, discussions, points that people want to raise? I do have copies of this breakdown if you would like to.
Alan,
Yes.
the 1970 meeting,
Yes.
what surprised me was the low level of dissent, particularly in the elders.
Yes.
Now, did the vote go through strongly, or was that just more of a thing that people weren't prepared to publicly dissent?
I was overseas when that happened, and so I don't know. I don't know if there was anybody who was here, but there was, there was an overture that came from the South Auckland Presbytery that resulted in
Surprise, surprise.
that resulted in the issues being raised, and there was debate that went on around them. But all I have in the record minutes only, of course, give you decisions that don't tell you the content of the debate. So you'd have to go back and look at newspapers and other things to see what happened in 1970. But I was surprised at the small number of elders. But then again, I think there have been other issues where Liberals have put in dissenting votes, where again there are a large number of ministers, but it's a much smaller number of elders on the debates on homosexuality, for example. That's been the case.
All right, well, Alan, on behalf of all of us here, the community of St Luke's, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart and our collective hearts for the presentation that you've given us this evening. You said that Professor Lloyd Geering has got an audience outside the institutional church, but I don't think there's any doubt for those of us that are here, if we were to consider ourselves as on the periphery of the institutional church, that in fact we are still very much part of that audience. And I think that the historical outline in the series of arguments that you've set out to explain how he got from where he was as a maths academic through to the point where he is continuing to write effectively about the future of humankind in the world today. It's been very well set up for the benefit of all of us, and I certainly have learned a huge amount this evening. I was reminded, and I have fact-checked this, but I may be wrong. There was a point in time when Charles Lai was asked what his view was about the impact of the French Revolution, and he said, well, it's too early to tell. I'm just wondering whether, in fact, we can draw the analogy in terms of the work of this wonderful man and what we've learned about him this evening. So, on behalf of us all, thank you very, very much for